Welcome back to the afternoon of the Caribou celebration. It's my pleasure to introduce Gunn, who is a caribou biologist who has worked all across Canada with First Nations and Inuit for many, many years. And I'm really pleased that she's here to share her wisdom with us. Anne.
Thanks, Sebastian, and I'm delighted to be here. I dressed for the job for you, so you can take everything I say with a pinch of salt. It's a delight to be here to celebrate the caribou, their wisdom and their generosity to us over thousands of years. But I think also as we celebrate them, we should be having a wary eye to the future. I'd like to start by thanking the Yukon Conservation Society for the chance to be here. I think the strength of my talk is in the photos. So I'd like to thank Peter Mather and Susan Morse. Susan's a photojournalist from the eastern US. And I'd like to really thank Joyce Majewski for sharing her prints with me and allowing me to use the images because they so beautifully make some of the points. And thank Graham Pelchut for producing such great maps. So I was asked to talk about the effects of disturbance on caribou. And it's a pretty hard topic because it's a diverse, disseminated topic. So I thought I would approach it more through the eyes of the caribou themselves. Caribou, the migratory tundra caribou, are a creature of space. Is there a problem with the sound? Or?
There's a little bit of feedback, but we're not quite sure.
Well, it's probably better if I don't try and fix it. I could.
There's some water here, Anne, if you need it.
Oh, okay, yeah, thanks. So caribou, their characteristic is the use of space and the use of the landscapes. And the way they see landscapes is probably quite different from us. So I'm going to suggest to you there's 3 landscapes that is the way they see through space, and it's those landscapes that our activities are impinging on. And the first one is a rather fanciful term, the landscape of fear, and that's the responses of caribou to predators. The effect that predators have is not just to kill them, but it changes their behavior. The caribou make choices between having enough to eat and avoiding being killed. So they're making choices they're trading off all the time. A quick example of that is this photograph of the Bathurst herd in late winter. And the safest place for the caribous is out on the lakes because they have the advantage of speed where they've packed the snow down, and they have the advantage of visibility. They can see their enemies coming. But to feed, they have to put themselves at risk by going into the bush. So that's a very simple example of some of the trade-offs they're making. The second landscape that has so much influence on them where they're making choices is foodscapes. So it's the availability of forage for them and the nutrition. And to us, this might look like a sea of green, but because the plants have their own agenda and growth strategies, the nutrition value in that sea of green is actually quite limited. And the caribou have to make a high degree of selection in order to be able to take in enough nutrition. So if those choices are constrained at all by avoiding predators or by avoiding us, then that restricts the amount of nutritious forage that they can take in. And I'm just going to show you one map that is from a PhD thesis by Kirsten Denreiter, who's a UNBC, and I think is shortly defending this thesis. But she looked at the fine detail of the forage available, its digestibility across the landscape for a single caribou. The point about the map is not the details, but look how fragmented the colors are. And the stronger the color, the red and the yellow, is where the caribou gets the maximum nutrition, depending on its, and it gets complicated because it's a consequence of bite size, bite rate. The caribou with their tongues can sort the food in their mouth and spit out the bits that aren't so useful. But the red and the yellow is where the caribou will get the most nutrition. So if their choices are constrained and they're pushed into the turquoise and the sort of the greenish color, they're losing out nutrition-wise. So again, it's all about choices. This is thanks to Joyce. This is the third landscape. Is caribou have been traveling these landscapes for thousands of years. So they have a memory and an experience that brings into affecting their movements. So this, Joyce said, was, I think they were entering the first canyon during migration. And they've been using those pathways so long as to leave marks on the rocks. So I think that one of the, besides migration, the other characteristic is what Justina mentioned, is about abundance. These caribou are usually together in huge numbers, which means they can pass information, their experience, good or bad, really quickly among themselves. And if there are gaps in how we've respected them in terms of thinking of the impacts of development, this is probably one of the major ones, is we don't concede that these caribou are learning as they go and they're passing information, and then they have their own version of traditional knowledge because they learn, the mothers learn, teach the calves, and so on. So this is not the part that shows up in formal environmental assessments, but it's probably how we teach them on the land is probably going to is a large factor in determining some of the effects of development. So switching now to talk about some of the effects of development. Some of the first studies go back to the Dempster in the late 70s, and actually Don Russell was one of the first people who look at how the caribou responded. And there were studies of how they responded to traffic. And the responses were stronger when people were hunting them, and the responses were stronger when the vehicles were coming at them. And I'm sure most of you who've been there, who've been with caribou, see that when they see you, they stop what they're doing, they look alert, they stop eating, and they may move off. At that time, those caribou are making choices, and the choices they make, I think, has caused one of the myths that you come across quite a bit. People see a photo like this, which is a bull caribou standing, actually this is at a gold mine in the NWT. But if you look at the pictures of Prudhoe Bay Oil Field, there are lots of photos of caribou standing on drill pads, crossing roads. And that then becomes, the interpretation of that becomes, what's the problem? They don't mind. But in fact, the caribou are choosing the lesser of two evils. There's their concerns about being around structures and people versus wolves and, of course, warble flies. There are fewer wolves around these developments, and the shade, say from an oil tank, gives the animal relief, the caribou relief from warble flies. So it's not that the caribou are not afraid, it's that they're choosing the least expensive option to them. Those pictures are almost always large bulls, because with respect to you guys, there's a big difference between males and females. Cows and calves tend to be very responsive. The cow is very well aware of the vulnerability of her calf, and she will make the decisions to safeguard the calf and also to safeguard her options for getting enough forage to provide the milk. So the sensitivity of the animals varies quite a bit according to their sex and age. At the same time, these studies were describing that caribou would spend, say, 6% more time standing or 6% more time running close to oil and gas development. People were also mapping the distribution of caribou relative to roads, mines, and oil fields. And this was in the 1980s. The general view was that there was an avoidance of about 4 kilometers from a road, although it varied with the amount of traffic. There was quite a bit of argument, biologists arguing back and forward about this, but I think generally the strength of the evidence is that it's a very real effect. And so when the first diamond mines, which are large open pit mines, were being introduced to the Northwest Territories, to the range of the Bathurst herd, there was an expectation that the caribou might avoid it by 4 kilometers. When we did the actual studies using aerial surveys and distribution, using the satellite collars, it was a surprise because it was more like averaged 14 kilometers. It varied a bit with the stage of construction versus actual operation of the mine, and it varied. It was relatively small and hard to detect around an underground mine, but the large open pit mines, it was clearly averaged about 14 kilometers, and that means there's a change in distribution. It's not, the caribou don't hit 14 kilometers and none of them go in. Some of them deflect, some of them go through, and some of them speed up. And at 14 kilometers, it was hard to think that the mechanism for this scale of avoidance, because it was unlikely to be sight, because the mine was pretty well out of sight at 14 kilometers. It probably wasn't the sound, although caribou have extremely sensitive feet, and we don't know how they feel the very low frequency sounds from blasting. It wasn't really thought to be a problem. So there was one factor that scaled at 14 kilometers, and that was the spread of very fine particle dust. So the top photo here shows the enhanced melting from the fallout of dust round one of the open pit mines. And the very fine particles actually travel further. And the monitoring that the mines were required to do, they didn't exactly volunteer, but they were picking up changes in the chemical constituents of lichens, and that effect continued out to 10, 12 kilometers. So lichens have a propensity to pick up atmospheric compounds, and so the lichens were showing a different chemical signal. Whether the smell of that or the taste of that was enough to affect the caribou. The other factor is whether it was the caribou's memory and experience started to operate. They had a bad time the previous year, or the cow did, and so they were starting an avoidance based on their intelligence and their learning ability. So, okay, the caribou, they don't, they reduce their foraging time by 6%. What's the big deal? I mean, people kept asking us that. And that question was going around in the 1970s and 80s, and the Porcupine Caribou Management Board were the people who spearheaded addressing that question by asking, I think it was Don Russell anyway, always Don Russell, but to start working on building a model that would start to look at the consequences of these interruptions to foraging and the increased movements. And the model was developed, and the word model is often off-putting to people, but it's simply a way of putting together relationships. I didn't do anything. I don't know. Where's my guru?
I think it might just be...
Getting excited? Okay, well, I'll keep going, or I can leave.
Please keep going.
Or I guess I can switch mics if you think if it's getting obnoxious.
I have this one. I will turn off.
Okay, so okay, so is that better? Okay. Now I can't get quite as excited, but anyhow. So a model is just a way of taking a lot of relationships and sort of working them through. So the input for the caribou model is all based on what we measure about their responses. So we look at their behavior, their activity, time spent foraging, time spent walking. We look at the amount of we look at the vegetation. We look at the quality of the vegetation in terms of diet. We look at the intake rate of the forage. And that's a lightning sketch of the model, because Don is sitting looking at me. The model is all the relationships of what happens to the food inside the animal. So how much is digested in the stomach, how much the animal allocates to its growth and replenishing its body reserves after the winter, and also how much it allocates to the growth of the calf and the amount of milk it produces. And then the model spits out all that information, those relationships, as the body weight of the cow, and the body weight determines her likelihood of becoming pregnant. It determines the body weight of the calf, which also determines the likelihood of the calf's survival. And those can feed into what happens to the trajectory, how much the population, the herd increases and decreases. So one quick example, this is for the Bathurst herd. It assumes that the caribou they reduced in the vicinity of the mine within 14 kilometers. If they spent about 20 days a year, and reduced their forage intake by 6%, it would change their body weight on an annual basis by just over a kilogram. And that would reduce her probability, the cow's probability, of becoming pregnant by 3%. Those are small numbers. They're low. We can't monitor for them because they're such small numbers. But over time, they add up. And if you took a 16-year time period, those cows who were exposed to the mine within the zone of influence, there would be just over 4,000 cows less. And again, 4,000 cows, 16 years, doesn't sound that much, but it's the other way of looking at it is it's a choice made by society that there's 4,000 cows less. This is in a herd where, because it's declined for a whole variety of reasons, I'll get into that later if I have time, but the harvest has been reduced to 0. So for people who've depended on this herd for thousands of years, the record is 7,000 years for this herd. Those 4,000 caribou being lost to the cumulative impact of the diamond mines and the exploration and the roads that support them is quite significant. If it was, the 4,000 is in an average growing plant degree day, so a spring of average plant growth. If it was a cooler spring and there was less plant growth, that would go up to 6,000, and if it was a really warm spring, lots of plant growth, it would correspondingly be reduced. So that's cumulative effects. They're projected numbers, but they're based on things that we can actually measure. One of the examples that has always been talked about is Prudhoe Bay Oil Field. It's started in the late 60s, and when the Central Arctic herd was relatively small. And the map shows in grey the oil fields, and then it shows the calving distribution based on satellite collars. During this time, to begin with, there were quite a few studies of the caribou's reaction, and so they reduced their foraging time and they moved away. They were 4 kilometers from the roads. Then the Alaskan government's emphasis changed, and there was very little study of the responses, and instead they made more effort to reduce the effects by, the main thing they did was they didn't put the elevated pipelines right next to the roadways. They separated them. And they also reduced the harvesting of the cows. So this graph shows the yellow line is the size of the herd since 1990, so it shows an increase with a peak about 2010, and then a fairly rapid decline. The red line is the size of the herd, the trend in the size of the herd for the Teshubuk herd, which is right next to the Central Arctic, shares a similar climate, but it has no development. And it was harvested at a very high rate of about 10%. So the two trends, to a degree, largely match. One of them had the oil field, and the costs to the caribou were traded off by reduced harvest rate. And the Teshubuk was harvested, as I say, at a relatively high rate. This, I'm skipping through a very complicated story, and this is why I used Joyce's print with the raven to get across that the Prudhoe Bay is one of the largest oil fields in North America, over 1,000 drill wells. It had ecosystem level effects. It changed the ecology of that region. From the caribou's point of view, there were actually more ravens, but there were fewer bears and fewer wolves. There was change in the surface hydrology, the drainage of the areas changed. There was astonishing amounts of dust accumulating along the roadsides that was changing the vegetation. It's measurable in soil profiles. So the cumulative effects of all those cascading changes on the caribou hasn't really been analyzed. So it's an incomplete story. And that puts at risk some of the predictions that it had no effect. So I'm just going to quickly talk about another set of effects of development on caribou. And that's, caribou have to deal with predators. The way they deal with hunting is likely quite different. They make different choices. And some of this is, there's a lot of work being done with elk, which shows that their habitat selection changes whether they're dealing with wolves or with predation. Then when they have to deal with roads, with or without hunting, the behavior changes accordingly. So I was just going to give you a quick example. This map shows the range of the Leaf River herd in northern Quebec, just on the east side of Hudson Bay. It was a large herd, it was about 700,000. It's now declining to 200,000. And it was the scene of the James Bay Hydro Project. So the line of lakes above the red line, which is the road that was built to service the hydroelectric projects. And those lakes are reservoirs created. And the grey lines are the movements of the satellite collared caribou during the fall and the winter. And it shows how the lakes funnel the animals' movements. But once the road was built, it became a focus for hunting, sports hunting. And the level of hunting was up until a few years ago, it was about 10,000 caribou per fall and winter. And since then it's been reduced to 3,000. But the road that was originally built for development became a focus of hunting. And it showed that there was a study done to look at the distribution of where the caribou were taken, but there wasn't a study done really to show the effect off the road on the caribou movements. But there was very clearly a pattern of avoidance because of the combined hunting and roads. I think Don is going to talk a bit about the Dempster, and the Dempster was originally built to facilitate development, and there's a long history of how the road and hunting have been managed. But I think Don will show a map that over time, the distance the caribou, the porcupine herd has avoided the Dempster has varied quite a bit because the amount of hunting and the amount of traffic has also varied. It's not just hunting. I mean, hunting is facilitated by roads for development, but roads that have been used, that are used for development where there is no hunting also show effects. This is an example of the Western Arctic herd, and there's you can see there's a open pit mine and a whole road, and there's relatively low frequency of trucks, about 4 trucks per hour. When the behavior of the caribou was looked at, it showed that some of the caribou took 10 days longer to cross the road than these are caribou with satellite GPS collars. Some of them only took 1 day, but some of them really delayed their movements. One of the roads, one of the diamond mines, a whole road, when people looked at the tracks in the snow, 60% of the caribou deflected. When they switched to camera traps, the apparent deflection rate became 1 to 2%. And the point is, how you measure things has a large impact on what you measure. So I hope I haven't sort of, lost you here, like there's a lot of what might seem to be scattered details, and that we're not losing sight of the wood for the trees. But if we start to think of seeing development in the context of caribou making choices based on the landscape of fear, like what are they most afraid of, what are their options, and then you start to think of a fragmented foodscape which limits the trade-offs they're starting to make, and then you start to think of what lessons we're teaching them, like what they're learning and what their experience is. It suggests that projecting the effects of development is very complex, but we do have the tools through using cumulative effects modeling allows us to deal with some of that complexity. Yikes, I'm on time. So these landscapes, it's very much in the eye of the beholder, but for example, for the Bathurst, the cumulated footprint, the zone of influence, on the summer range of the Bathurst is already at 12%. We don't know what that means, and does that mean it could be doubled before it started to have a major effect on the herd, or what time frame? But I think development is starting to creep up where the options for the caribou being reduced, and the converse of that is the options for management are being constrained as well. So there needs to be a lot more advanced thinking. There is a lot of talk about mitigation, and if it was very successful, it would be a reasonable prediction that the zone of influence should be shrinking. And there doesn't seem to be, for the mines where it's being measured, that isn't the case. So I would suggest that mitigation is a lot more thought needs to go into testing it, to making sure that it is effective and it is efficient, to make the landscape predictable to the caribou, and if society has chosen to develop or not, to be fair to the developers, to make their working environment more predictable, which might improve how they go about mitigation. If we start working with these landscapes while they're still relatively resilient, I think we'll have a greater chance of success. And I think that takes more respect for the caribou, particularly as their recovery. We need to get the recovery underway. And the key thing will be making the landscape predictable for them. And I think we collectively need to make our voices louder and more sure to the governments, so that they are hearing that there is more than disquiet over what's happening to the caribou, and that there are things we can do about them. So some of that will take more innovative use of techniques, and I really like this picture of Peter's using a camera trap. And I think a camera trap is an example of a non-invasive, so much more respectful way of monitoring what's happening on the landscape. And there are other non-invasive techniques, including measuring stress. And we're starting to realize that caribou around roads and mine sites do show increased stress hormones. And so it's one of the things we should start to take into account. So anyhow, that's enough from me. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Anne, very much. Yes, I have some questions. So, next up is Anne's, not her partner, but partner in crime here, if you like, or in caribou. Don Russell worked for many years for the Canadian Wildlife Service on caribou in general, but in the porcupine caribou in particular. And his name's come up a couple of times today already, both from Joe Tadlici talking about the Porcupine Caribou Management Board's efforts, where Don has done a tremendous amount of science on there. And you can see some of his work on their website if you go trolling through it. And anyway, so thank you, Don, for coming. And here.
I'll say, well, while you're doing it. So the first time I actually worked with caribou happened to be at Prudhoe Bay, before there was a pipeline, back in 1973. And when Anne said that's when the Central Arctic herd was much smaller. Actually, they didn't even know there was a Central Arctic herd. What they said was there's some resident animals, but it's really an overlap of the Western Arctic herd on the west and an overlap with porcupine on the east, neither of which was true, because there's another herd in between Central Arctic and the Western Arctic, which is the Teshepuk herd. So that whole development did their EIS and stuff with pretty minimal knowledge about what's going on with caribou in the area. I guess this tells me what I'm supposed to do. It's all loaded. Press this thing?
Nope.
Nope.
This one.
Alrighty.
To advanced slides.
Okay.
Just this one there.
All right.
Go
If
back.
I want to go back, I go there. Anyways, thanks for to YCS for organizing this and the Vuntut Gwitchin, I understand. And a number of people have already set me up nicely. Joe, to start with, talking about a lot of the work that the PCMB has done, particularly with harvest management. Justina, in terms of being able to set the context in terms of what the porcupine herd is and how it's doing in relation to the other barren ground herds in the designatable Unit 3. And then, of course, with Anne, dispensing with all the disturbance stuff so I don't have to talk about it. So what I wanted to do was just give you my spin on, and obviously we discuss things sometimes every day, as to why I think the porcupine herd is doing so well, and on the flip side, why the ones east of us, across the delta, are doing so poorly. And the way I'm going to tackle it is just talk about a little bit about landscape diversity, comparing. So all the time I will be talking about comparing what the porcupine herd does, and we've heard the Bathurst example east of the delta with all that development within their range, as the surrogate for what's happening on the barrens. And I've done a lot of analysis on climate and everything, and really there's quite a dramatic difference east and west. So this is kind of an east and west comparison, as well as specifically for the porcupine herd and the Bathurst herd. So with respect to climate, do some comparison with focusing in on summer and winter drought conditions. Drought conditions on summer and winter ranges. It's obviously summer drought that I'm interested in. Looking at these two concepts of productivity and resilience, and where we've taken that, and then harvest that keeps coming up, and something called the ratchet effect, and then what are the implications. So I'm just going to zero in on those four, although you could go on at some length on each one of those. And this is the population estimates of the porcupine herd in black and the Bathurst herd in red. So you can see when back in the early 80s or the mid 80s, it was roughly, as Joe said, 470,000 Bathurst animals, and we were sitting down at 100. Where's my glasses? Roughly 165,000, something like that, peaking out at 178 in '89. So I've had dealings with Gunn. Oop! Ignore the legend. Ignore what it says. Pay attention to what I say. Oh, well, maybe I got this wrong all the way through the legend. Maybe it's a porcupine herd's diving. Anyways, good. I actually was a test. So back in when caribou were at the heydays in the 80s and 90s, and discussions with Anne, she called the porcupine herd a cute little oddity. Because it wasn't like any of the herds she worked with, and she had real herds up to, 400,000, 500 for the Camaneriac. She wasn't quite so smug. Yeah, around 2006. smugness kind of disappeared. But as you can see, there's quite a different history to these herds, and there's probably good reasons for it. And neither of them is necessarily a wrong strategy for the herds. They've always evolved within their environment to best adapt to the environment. So when you have, and I guess I'll be pushing this, a very diverse, stable environment, you can afford to be stable. When you've got a very unstable environment and erratic, you got to take advantage when the advantages come to you, and therefore you can be a lot more productive. But then you pay for it when times change. So here's once you get further west, and all the herds that Justina was talking about, Porcupine, Central, Tashapuk, and Western Arctic herd, live in this very diverse environment. And diversity means stability. Meaning no matter how bad the conditions are, you can always find something very close that's better. Whereas you get out onto the Canadian Shield and you hit bad conditions, you either got to move a lot or you just grin and bear it. So we could stop right there and say that's probably a good reason. But there are things on those ranges that are also different that help one herd and disadvantage the other. We've amassed a tremendous database on climate for all circumpolar herds. So we have climate data on a daily basis from 1979 to 2016 for calving range, summer range, fall, winter, and spring ranges for 23 different herds around the circumpolar north. So it's very, what I like to do is playing around with a lot of this data, and you start looking at where are some of the trends and what some of the differences, and can that account for some of the changes that are taking place. Did I get this one right? Yes, you did. Yes, I did. So the black is the sort of a 3-year running average of summer drought conditions on the summer range, or July drought conditions on the summer range for the porcupine, which is black, and Bathurst, which is red. So obviously the higher the drought index, the higher the drought. And you can see since roughly when the porkies started their decline and Bathurst started their decline, the porcupine herd has been consistently low in terms of summer drought conditions. And drought is a combination of temperature and moisture and precipitation, and how that carries through from day to day. So you can build up a drought index and then get a good rain, and then the drought index goes down. But the difference really is the fact that consistently, and it hasn't been a trend, but consistently east of the delta is a roughly a 2-degree summer temperature increase compared to west of the delta. And the other thing is, since the 90s, the Bathurst herd has been getting less and less precipitation, and the porcupine range is getting more and more. So not only is the drought conditions different, but I would maintain that a drought isn't bad for the porcupine herd compared to the Bathurst herd. If you look at the diversity thing, summer range of the porcupine herd is really deep permafrost dominated soils compared to the shield country, which is shallow bedrock dominated. So you put heat on that and no precipitation. Worst thing that could happen to the porcupine herd is you melt a little bit of permafrost. Plants are still get plenty of moisture. You put heat on that Canadian shield country, and really the plants, they'll the A will not produce very much, and then they'll start lignifying really early. So nutritionally, summer range, right, that little window of time in the year when herds have to actually replenish all their muscle mass that they lost over winter and put on enough fat and produce enough milk for their calves. Drought can be devastating. So drought, as I said, is a combination of precip and temperature, but temperature is also related to the warble index that Anne talked about. And because temperatures across the shield are warmer than west, we can also just have a look at what the warble index has been in again, the 3-year running average to get rid of all the variability for the Bathurst and the Porcupine. And notice how there's been a tremendous increase roughly from about 2006 on within the Bathurst range to a pretty unprecedented high in 2014. Now, 2014, so this is drought and stuff for the summer range, so I took it to the winter range as well. And this is the yearly drought index on the winter range, which I'll call now fire weather index because it's the same thing. And you look at some of those years, so really the only year, so if I ran through all the years that was available, the only year that the Porcupine Range really received a lot of fires was 2004. But you can see it was also quite high across the Mackenzie. And then you look at those two high years, 2014. 2014 was the by far highest forest fire acreage burned or hectares burned. I think it was 34,000 square kilometers burned, essentially all on the winter range of various herds on the shield. And you take that to 2015, and that was the second worst year for fires. Remember I said 34,000 square kilometers. The second worst was 6,500. So you can see how bad the 2004 one was. But in both of those years, Porcupine Range was spared. So if you look at the accumulated fire across the ranges of all those herds, and roughly the blue line in the NWT is where the winter ranges are, NWT herds, and the Porcupine Range. And the point is, again with the diversity, small fires actually increase diversity because you're going to always have a continual age class of caribou or sort of replenishing lichens in a very small area. Compare that to large fires, which actually decrease diversity. It's kind of faded. And here's my little spiel on least productive, but the most resilient herd. This was the last slide of a 25-minute talk I gave at North American Caribou Workshop. So I figured I didn't have 25 minutes to explain it, so you just have to trust me. But essentially, the long term, these lines represent, so you got body weight at the bottom, which I call relative body weight, and the probability that a cow will get pregnant. And that generally it's a shape like this, where there is a very steep part of the curve, inflection point, and then as you get higher, the point goes up. And the steeper the line is, what I call is they're not very resilient, meaning if you move 5% body weight, you're going to lose a lot of probability of getting pregnant. So the shallower the line, the more resilient. But the closer the line is to the y-axis there, the more productive the herd is, because you can be smaller and smaller body weights and still get pregnant. So it's a strategy where you take advantage of good times, but you pay for bad times. And it even shows in this probability of pregnancy. Now something's got to give, of course. So this resilient, the really resilient and not very productive with respect to their probability of pregnancy, but something's got to pay, and it's probably calf size. So, but you're making more of an investment in a cow than a calf, so it makes more sense. Okay, the last sort of issue I wanted to talk about, what regulates these herds. So you look at populations at high and low parts of their cycle, and really it's at the high population parts, it's really a bottom-up regulation. Something's got to happen to the food, or they're getting such high densities that transmission rates for disease and parasites increase. But as you get low, the importance of harvest and predators, and it's a much more top-down regulation, meaning there's time for food to recover, our density is lower, so transmissions. So what keeps it down there then is how you deal with harvest and predators at that time. And essentially that's what that says. So at the peak there's high densities, and these large herds can sustain high harvests and predators. We don't think harvest and predators ever driven one of these large migratory herds and caused a decline, but it becomes more important as it goes down at lows, and they get into what is called an Ali effect, which essentially says that harvest doesn't immediately reflect low numbers. So they just try harder, and harvest isn't a response. If you plot population size to harvest, there's no relationship. Can still stay up, the numbers can still stay high. And this was really characterized by the whole Atlantic cod, where their whole management strategy was to track harvest. But by the time they realized they were in trouble, it was too late. Okay, so really quickly here. So higher peak of harvest, we can talk a bit about the ratchet effect. So population size is greater, and the demand starts to grow. So you have a greater demand at high population levels for these herds that are very large. And that's fine, it works fine, but herds decline. And then so the phenomenon is easier to ratchet up demand when times are good and there's high densities of animals, but it's harder to reduce that demand. And the time lag is the important thing. So first of all, you've got to be able to detect that populations are going down. You've got to be able to formulate a response that how you might do that. And then there's consultation through all levels of government. And then you actually have to respond. And the worst case scenario for this time lag is when you have high demand and a rapid decline. Whereas the best case, of course, would be a low demand and a slow decline. So if we look at the porcupine, did I get this wrong again? No, I corrected it. So this was the population estimates through time, and the red is the Bathurst, the percent of that population that was harvested. So you can see at the early years when things were good, there's 6, 7, 8% of the herd was harvested. We're talking about 20,000, 15,000 animals. And this was a very in-depth study done with the dog ribs. And then when the herd started to go down, there was a response, and that average harvest dropped to about 7,000. But with a herd that's dropping so fast, by 2009, 22% of the herd was harvested. If you believe the 7,000. And you compare that to the porcupine, the demand has never been higher than 2.4% when there was data collected. And you heard Joe talk about the mid-70s. I didn't have the harvest numbers, but there was very low harvest, And not only do these represent total harvest, but for the if you switch your harvest from cows to bulls, then it's going to have way less impact on the population. So I think this one tells why. So now, as Anne said, there's no harvest on the Bathurst herd, and it's kind of leveled off a bit. So anyways, implications. Similar diagram to this is all the past diagrams of all the GPS colors. So I think you saw things were favorable in terms of some of the climate, but I think we have to keep up this climate monitoring and be able to assess what the impact of that is. We have a very favorable situation with return to human disturbance within it. But all we have to do, if you look at that dense up 1002 area, is this herd is not very productive, which is characteristic of it. So therefore, it doesn't take much to prevent an increase or to accelerate a decline. So we have to really assess what the impacts of that disturbance. And I think the other part was managing demand, and Joe alluded to that. The fact that a lot of the communities east of the Delta have no caribou, and sharing is a very important aspect of the Gwitchin culture. I think that has to be managed, that's all. So you don't build a huge expectation, and then the porcupine goes down, and it might take years before that. But all the talk that Joe was talking about was there is mechanisms in place. There's the annual harvest monitoring, the management strategy. So that time lag, even though it was developed during a time of uncertainty as to what trajectory the herd was done, the fact that it's in place means that that timeline could be within a year. You could make decisions as long as you can enforce them. And I guess this was somewhat related to Sebastian's talk. I don't think we know all about the impacts of the Dempster, but to me, there's something going on. The year that Sebastian had the dots, there was just a tremendous movement through that particular year in October, and that's all these parallel lines. But that was a fairly rare event in terms of that many collars moving through. If you did it this year, you wouldn't even see a gray line on there. But I think we got a lot more work to do with looking at what the potential impacts of disturbance is, as Anne pointed out, and she put out a lot of challenges, and I think we could take one up on the Dempster. Thanks.
We've got a few minutes for questions, so for Dawn or Anne, if you want to give them to her.
Anne, get up here. I knew that was going to happen.
Don, or Anne, are there a lot of studies that show that northern part of the shield has been basically drying out, like the vegetation studies and wetlands and all that kind of stuff?
See, I thought you should grab a mic.
I'll give her this one.
I mean, the climate data is pretty clear that the drought index, they've had quite a long string of drought on what we call the winter range of those herds. And it sure showed up in 14 and 15.
There's other questions.
Okay. Well, I mean, has there been specific studies on the impacts of vegetation there? Not that I'm aware of, but I don't know much.
Yes, I think so. I'm not a botanist or vegetation scientist, but yes, I think there's been quite a bit of work. But it's not tied to the caribou ranges per se. So right. It's not always very useful. Maybe that's a short answer.
Julie?
I actually have two questions, and one is for Anne and one is for you. I was just wondering about, where are you? Oh, I was wondering about the 14 kilometers road dust disturbance and the lichens. And forgive me if I miss this, but what about just the fact that the lichens are dusty? I mean, and I know I go far away from the road when I'm picking berries or harvesting things. Would that have affected their consumption of the lichens within 14 kilometers also? Just the fact they're gritty and dusty?
The elders that we go out with from the Clecho, so who are the indigenous people, they comment on that grittiness. And there've been no, so I would say that was, it makes sense. I mean, you can feel it. If you lick the lichen, you can feel it on your tongue. But there have been no formal studies to investigate what that means. So there is the surface stuff. There is a gritty feeling. When they test the lichens for the change in chemicals, they wash them. So that probably reduces the change in the chemical level. So I guess that's a yes-no answer, if that helps.
And the other thing, and maybe both can answer this, is I have heard actually frequently in the past that the vegetation on the calving ground is changing because of climate change, that it's getting brushier and whatever. And are there any studies on that, and what kind of an effect, because that is a small area, there's not a lot of biodiversity there, that is a small area, and if it's changing, and what effect that might be having?
Any of the shrubby, what do they call it, shrubbing of the tundra has tended to be closer to tree line, and there was a time I was up there every year. I haven't been up there for quite a few years, and just the the tussock tundra and the wetlands and high and low centered polygons is not really conducive to a lot of shrubbiness, but I could be wrong. Jim's been on North Slope, or had been, before he got old. For doing vegetation work, he might have an opinion. But no, I'm if I had to guess, I would say no, it's not a big issue. Anne has.
It might be different on the Canadian Shield, because on the Bathurst calving ground, there's been, based on satellite imagery, a reduction in the lichens that was attributed to a change in the cover of the signal for shrubs. But it's all based on imagery. It's not based on ground sampling. So it's indicative. It's interesting, but it's not quite clear as to whether that's part of the warming trend induced expansion of shrubs.
I think that, the question is a good one in the sense that there's this tendency to use a broad brush when you talk about climate change and, it's warming. Well, for one region, that's bad. For another region, neutral. Another region, it's good. So, I think it's a lazy way out to paint those broad brushes. And you have to look at each specific habitat and know something about it.
Yep. Don, I just wanted to ask something about the migration. And, the pull of the migration is so strong. We see it even on Oak Crow, where when they start when they start their trek back to the calving grounds, even the ice moving will not deter them. They'll just try to go. So my question is, the pull of the migration to go either to the calving grounds or to their winter range is so great that they'll get there no matter what. My question is, on the Dempster Highway, east of the highway, they haven't gotten to their habitat range, their winter range, to the upper Peel for maybe in 20 years. They've gone to Lusk Lake, which is Caribou Mountain, Caribou Lake for us. what do you think the cause of it? Is it the Dempster Highway? Is it, I mean, that's $1 million question, but.
I mean, it's compelling to look at that and say it's the Dempster. I think to do a proper job, you'd have to look, okay, where are the fires? Are they related to, or is there some correlation between east and west? You want my opinion? I think they're reacting to hunting on the highway. But I could be totally wrong, and I think there has to be a proper analysis of it. Sorry.
Yeah.
It's a cop
Yeah, I'm
out,
stumped
isn't it?
too.
So, I mean, right now, this isn't differentiated by season, but the movement down tends to be fall, the movement up. So then down the Dempster, and the one that's going straight up tends to be spring. So really, there's not a lot of spring migration associated with the Dempster, but it could be, as you're saying, well, that's because there's nothing on the southeast side of it. Otherwise, obviously, they'd have to cross it. But for the last 10 years that we have these GPS collars, this could be, where's Graham? Was this satellite and GPS? Oh, okay, so back to 96, I think. Yeah. So this is 21 years of movement data. Most of the spring movement isn't associated with the Dempster. Not that
So
you
I
couldn't
guess
find caribou
another
there.
question is, they probably know something that we don't know.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Okay.
The question here was first.
Oh, Mary, you already had a question. No, I'm just kidding.
I'm referring to the landscape of memory that Anne talked about. And I know this doesn't refer to the Porcupine Caribou Herd, but when the 40-mile herd came back into the Yukon in fairly large numbers about 3 or 4 years ago, they hadn't been in that area for a very long time. So is it magic or is it memory?
Well, they haven't, but I've seen pictures of the old range with tracks etched in rock. So, I mean, are there cues they're picking up that this was the typical migration? I mean, it's a really good point because they haven't been back for years and years.
So the cows can't be teaching the calves because...
No, there's, Anne's the memory person, but go ahead.
I think there's two time scales. The memory is, there's the memory that the landscape, through ease of travel, the animals would tend to repeat it. And then there's the more immediate memory, the tradition that the cows pass on to their calves. So it's not one or the other, they both are operating together. And if there's a gap, as there was for the 40-mile, the George and Leaf River both had large gaps where they were absent from most of their range. And according to the memory of the people, is that they tend to repeat their travel lines. And then there's the more immediate responses that gets passed on. So it's both, it's not one or the other. They're kind of like us, they're pretty smart, only we sometimes have different ways of showing it.
Another example is Baffin Island, which has undergone, as Justina said, tremendous decline, and they did a number of community meetings trying to get what knowledge they had of movements, and they said, well, and there's trails still etched, when those trails get green, they'll come back. So, and they'll reoccupy the same ranges. So there's still a lot of cues on the landscape, I think.
So, A number of years ago, there was some speculation that there might be some dust effects from the dumpster, such that vegetation was affected and caribou might be avoiding the immediate area of the dumpster because of dust accumulating on lichens, etc. But when I see this map, even though it's a bit hard to see the gray from back here,
That's great.
it,
Yeah, right.
it reminds me of a discussion I had many years ago with a bird biologist from southern BC that was working in some of the protected areas, and he was describing to me Canada geese flying 400 to 500 meters, following the line inside the protected area on their migration, like, because they knew if they crossed the line, they would be harvested. So yeah, it would be interesting, to look at the dust question and.
So you're saying that south and east of the driveway just might be downwind of prevailing winds.
Possibly.
Definitely the winter where it's like a wind tunnel down there.
Yeah,
I mean,
it would be
yeah,
interesting to
might
look
not
at
be
that.
as simple as one would think.